It's good to see you this morning. God is good, and we serve a God who loves us and wants to bless us, and we're glad that you're here. And Pastor Brian is actually going to be speaking for today and for the next 2 weeks. So we're starting this week actually a series on worship. He's going to be speaking three weeks on worship. He's got a heart for worship. He leads us in worship every week, and so this is an area where he has really invested himself, and there's going to be some great opportunity for you to hear about what it means to be a worshiper and live the life of a worshiper. We're not talking about like, oh, lift up my hands and shout louder. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the Bible's heart for worship. But the reason that I want to just emphasize to you these sermons is because these sermons are what's leading us into Passover. Passover is all about the gods that you worship. And today, beginning and in the next 2 weeks, God's going to be calling us to the story of Passover and helping us grasp the fact that it's really about the worship of the true and living God, and God severing us from the worship of false idols. And so as God unpacks that message for us, I'm encouraging you to respond not only with the recognition that we are in a season where the impossible becomes possible. And that's what this year's been all about. God's going to bring us through the impossible so he can show us what he can do by his grace and his mercy. So you need to know that during the season, you're confronting the impossible whether you know it or not. And the pathway through is worship. The pathway through is to live a life where we're looking upward to God. The word of the Lord this year to us was that he's going to bring us to the impossible and take us through by grace. Worship is the mechanism that God wants to use. So for the next 3 weeks, if you're looking at your life saying, it's impossible, this is the sermon series that's going to help reorient your view so that you make it through Passover saying, yeah, God really did destroy some idols in my life this year. So Pastor Brian, come on up. Let's give it up for Pastor Brian this morning.
That was good. That was good. I think I'm ready to go home now. I mean, that was like, whoo. All right, good morning, everybody. I have a lot on this stand here, so it's going to be a balancing act. Just give me one moment. Got to open the Bible, got my sermon notes. I'm still sweaty from worship. Did you guys hear me say that? Did I say that out loud? All right. What is worship? So the topic we're going to be exploring over the next couple of weeks together. And I brought my sidekicks today. I wanted to copy Pastor David with Karen and Sharon. So I have Sharpie and Yellow Balloon. That's what I brought today. So these will come in and assist me later. So until then, you're going to be wondering, what is going on? So this morning, the vision what we're talking about is the idea of living sacrifice. What we sacrifice for is what we worship. And there's this idea, worship comes from the word worship. I'm going to touch on that in a moment. The question that we ought to be asking today is it worth it? So I'm hoping we can identify together today through the word, through God's Spirit, some of the idols that we are worshiping. Maybe we're not seeing it that way, and see really how those things are pointing us to Jesus. Jesus is calling us to worship him in distinction to all these other things that grab our attention. So we're going to jump in this morning and talk about living sacrifice. Where does that idea come from? Is that up there? All right. Romans 11:36 through 12:1. If you want to write something down this morning, this is one thing to write down. This is a verse that I continually go to as a worship leader, and I'm reminded of what worship is. And here in this passage, it lines out a couple of ideas I want you to notice. It says, for from him and through him and to him are all things. This is talking about God. And it says, to him be glory forever. Amen. So the idea essentially here is God is everything. He's created everything. He's all in all. He's sustaining everything. And because of that, he is glorious. There's no comparison when we look at the sun cresting over a beautiful mountaintop and we say, oh, that's beautiful, that's glorious. That doesn't even come close to the glory of the God who created all of that. And so he says from this place, Paul's writing to the Roman church, and he says, I appeal to you, therefore, because God is glorious, brothers, by the mercies of God, now notice this, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, he says, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Our worship is presenting ourselves as living sacrifice. So what does that mean? Just think about that for a moment. It's kind of an oxymoronic statement. Sacrifice, the idea is you take something and you slaughter it and you pour out its blood. It's dead. It's gone. But the other hand, he's saying, no, be alive. You're a living sacrifice. So there's this play on words here that I want you to catch just for a second as I introduce this sermon series here. We're catching this play on words. First and foremost, this alive, dead dynamic really is we are to be dead to ourselves, like that sheep or a lamb that was slaughtered in the tabernacle or the temple, the place where we had access to God's presence before Jesus came. We are to be dead to ourselves, our desires, all the things that lead us astray, and we're to be alive unto God. And so he's saying each day live into that place just like Jesus did that. So there's this sense of every day we're saying no to ourselves. Every day we're deciding and we're saying yes to Jesus, and that costs us something. But there's this other nuance in it I would like to pull out. Have you ever thought about where the root of a word comes from? If you're kind of nerdy, you do that. I'm nerdy, so I do that. And so when I think of that word decide, tell your neighbor right now, decide. Decide. Inherent within that word, in the Latin, it means to cut. It means to cut. Where are you going with this, Pastor Brian? Well, think of a sacrifice. What do? You're cutting. They rend those things apart. They don't just spill the blood, but they cut it apart. It's a bloody, brutal affair. And there's this sense every single day we're cutting. We're deciding yes for something, and when we decide yes, we're cutting off the possibilities of all these other things. So I want you to hold that in your mind for a second. Every day, I want you to leave with this church, every day you are living the reality of sacrifice. Whether you realize it or not, you're living the reality of sacrifice. So this idea, Paul is genius in saying this, be a living sacrifice, and he's calling us to this higher place. We're living sacrifice one way or the other. What is the type of living sacrifice he's calling us to? That's what we're going to jump into. Our culture knows all about this topic, this idea of living sacrifice. I love talking to people who don't ascribe to Jesus or don't follow Jesus. And I like to talk with them, and I like to tell them, you know what? You're a worshiper. If you're here today and you don't follow Jesus, I want you to know that. I'm going to do it again exactly the same way. You're a worshiper. You worship. And you're like, no, I don't. What are you talking about? That's like some church thing. I'm talking about this. Look, the law of scarcity. Law of scarcity is an economic system. It says an economic system cannot produce all goods and services that consumers want, and most consumers do not have the resources to purchase everything they want. Can I have an amen? We all live with this day in and day out. We realize this. Here enters choice, or that word, decide. We must choose how to use the limited resources we have to best satisfy the unlimited wants we have. Right? It's getting that small carton of Haagen-Dazs versus that huge old bathtub full of that weird whatever ice cream it is that comes in the tubs. That's not even ice cream. I don't know what that is, but it just depends on your appetite, right? So I always go for the small one. The law of scarcity. We live this day in and day out. So if you're here and you don't follow Jesus or you're listening, I just want you to put that in your mind for a second. The law of scarcity is saying tomorrow when you wake up, you're going to decide to spend your breath, your time, your energy, your talent, your treasure, all toward a particular purpose. And when you do that, you're saying no to other things. When you're saying, well, you haven't told me that this is worship. Well, let me get there. Let me help you get there real quick. Worship, when you look it up in the dictionary and you look across the Bible, it really denotes a religious system expressing allegiance, honor, now catch this word, or worth toward a principle, person, or deity. You can express allegiance to a person, worth toward a person, toward a deity, toward a principle, an ideal. Another way of looking at this is it's the acknowledgement of worth, which is where the word worship comes from. It's an Old English word that actually is right there. It says worth-ship. And so when you look at the Hebrew word, saha, that idea is to bow down in homage or to bow down. You bow yourself down for the sake of lifting something else up or someone else up. The idea is you're attributing worth or value to this person, principle, deity, whatever that is. Some of us, it's ice cream. Somebody said, come on. Well, I don't want to show you that yet. Come on. So we give something, we give time, we give talent, we give treasure, we're making decisions. All of this, I would say, I would put in the language of sacrifice. Tomorrow, if you wake up, you decide you're going to exercise. You're sacrificing time in the morning with your family, perhaps. You're saying, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm doing this. You're going to sacrifice your body temporarily for the sake of your body in the long run. We understand in our culture this idea of sacrifice, and the law of scarcity at the same time is constantly pressing in on us. How many of you here have kids or have raised kids? Raise your hand. Have you ever noticed unlimited desire in your children? Somehow they're like the birds in Finding Nemo. They don't say mine, although they do say that. They say more, 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 more. I just got you new jeans. More, more. They have grass stains and holes in them, Dad. More. I need more food. You already ate a whole box of cereal. What's the deal? More, more. It's just like constantly, right? But then you get out in the world around adults, it's the exact same thing. It's like more, 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 more. We all live with this. And so we're in this dynamic tension of this unlimited need with limited resources. And there enters in this idea of sacrifice. We're making judgments in a world of scarcity. We have to choose to forego one thing for the sake of bestowing value on another thing. So the question is what we're valuing, is it worth it? Is it ultimate? We're all worshipers, Jesus followers, and not. So let me give you an example of how this works out. Say I love fashion, and I love clothes. My value is my image, but I don't have a job because I still live at home. And I want something new every single week. It sounds like I'm trying to get the best of everything, right? Doesn't it kind of sound like the American culture at all? Like, I want everything now, and I want it cheap, so I'm going to the dollar store. My son asked me recently, how much does this item cost at the dollar store? My wife and I looked at each other, and we said, you need to grow up a little bit. Just costs $1. So what is the cost here? It seems like we're getting everything for nothing. Well, a couple of years ago, this happened. It's the Save Our building in Bangladesh, a key factory for producing goods like they sell at H&M, where it's something new every single week, fast fashion. Over 1,100 lives were lost in this incident. Reports were given for the bad building, the structure issues, and yet people were pressed because of their living needs and things to just keep showing up to work every single day. The reality is we live in a world of constant decision-making, and there's sacrifice involved with it. And so I brought this up to you not just because I'm a minimalist, but because I want you to realize right now in this moment, I just want there to be a gravity around something. Often you're making decisions, you see the surface level cost, but you don't see the cost that's incurred the thousands of miles away so you can get that shirt. You don't see the sacrifice that is incurred 2 decades down the road when your kids hate you because you decided that you loved your job more than you loved them. Often we are unable to calculate what the cost actually is. And if you want to do some nerding out of economics, you can see that there's the law of unintended consequences that are present constantly in economics. So we see worship's embedded into everything, and yet us as finite beings trying to cover up the infinite need we have, we're unable to see and count the cost. So we're going to keep pressing forward from here. You guys with me? Are you with me? Okay, all right. This is important for us to grab hold of when we're thinking of what worship is, because the first mention of worship in the Bible is about living sacrifice, and it carries this idea to bow down. What we forego doesn't just cost us, it costs the world around us. Genesis 22. Would you guys turn there with me? There's a couple things I want to draw out of this passage. Why are we here? Well, we're in Genesis 22 because this is the first place the Hebrew word for worship is interpreted, for bowing down or worship is interpreted and seen in the Bible. And we see worship before this point, but we notice this word specifically and pointedly here in Genesis 22, 1 through 5. I want to call to mind this story, and as we read through it, would you just for a moment suspend the chasm or the distance between cultures and between time and all those things that would leave us separating ourselves from Abraham in the story? Would you enter into the story with me for a moment and read it as your own story? That's where we're going to draw some things out. Often we can put biblical characters on a pedestal and act like, oh man, they had it all together, I'm never going to be like that. Really, the only one who's like that is God in the whole story of the Bible. Abraham invites us into introspection of our own life and our own worship. So I'm going to read from Genesis 22. It says, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. We're going to continue to read in this through verse 14. But I wanted you to notice that word worship there. There's a couple ideas I want to specifically point out right away. Notice what God says. He says, Abraham. And God responds, here I am. And he says, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. Notice this. Worship, these are some things to write down if you want to get geeky about worship. Worship originates with God. That's a big deal. You might be sitting here like, well, duh, what? No, it's a big deal because in our culture we think worship originates with us. We think it's our idea. So just want you to just ponder this for a second. In verse 1, God is initiating with Abraham. God's initiating with you in your life right now, and he's saying, worship me. He's saying, attribute ultimate worth to me because I am worth that. I created you. I'm sustaining you. And oftentimes we kind of think that God is just like bad pizza we ate, and we're like, nah, I'm not going to do that. I think I'm going to just keep doing what I'm doing. Worship originates in God. And so if we miss that point, we miss the entire thing altogether. God defines the place in the participation, verse 2. He tells us what kind of offering to bring. He tells us where to bring it, when to bring it, how to bring it. God defines the design of our worship. Now think about this, guys. Moriah. It says the next day he gets up, saddles his donkey, and how many days does it take him? 3. Raise your hand if you drove 3 days journey to get to church this morning. No hands. Think about that. Think about God defining in such a way in your life, and you hear it, and he says, I want you to go to the church that's 3 days away from you. You're like, I ain't got that much gas money, God. Sorry, it's not going to work. Sorry, bro. Verse 3. God tells us Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, and who was with him? His son, Isaac. It starts off in verse 1. God tested Abraham. God tested Abraham. Does it feel like in your life right now sometimes it feels like, oh, God, you're testing me. What is going on? Why am I torn? Why am I pressed? Why is there this tension present? Why are you asking me for this thing? And God's entering, he's saying, I'm the origin of worship. I'm initiating worship. I'm defining worship. And all of that is testing us in such a way to prove to us where our allegiances are, what we think is ultimate. Since true worship originates in God's call, design, and place, we know we are placing our worth somewhere else, which I would define as false worship. We know we're putting our worth somewhere else when we change God's terms. When we change God's terms. This is big. In a culture of individualism, of independence, we change his terms. You didn't say tithe 10%, did you? Let's do 2%. You just want me to give from my heart. I'm just going to do 2% and you stay there forever. I'm not saying it's wrong to start there, but then you start to read into the Bible who you are and where you're at. And again, now, who is the origin of worship? You are. He's testing us. God says, forgive. Forgive your spouse. You don't know the lady. Come on, God. Forgive your parents. You don't know them. Come on, Jesus. You wouldn't expect that of me. God defines for us. And look at Abraham. He's journeying 3 days. Sometimes it feels like a 3-day drive to get to church when you're struggling in this place, doesn't it? You're in the car with your spouse and you guys are just tense about something. It's like, I don't even know if we're going to make it to church. It feels like it's taken 3 days, God. And he's saying, I know. And you make it, you come here and you bow down. That's good worship. That is good worship, church. Second point. Worship requires a sacrifice. Worship. You're giving value to something, which means it's going to cost you something. Worship tests what we value. Therefore, it always costs us something valuable. What did he say to Abraham? Your son, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and sacrifice him. Now, we can take that at face value, but I want you guys to think about this. If you flip back a page, you find out Isaac isn't Abraham's only son. When I read that passage last night, again, just immersing myself in the story, God saying, your only son, Isaac, I just was in the place of Abraham, and my heart was stung with Abraham's failure in what he chose to do in making worship originate in him, defining the terms, and his wife saying, let's hatch this scheme so we can get this son that God promised us. This is the story of Abraham, and they birthed an Ishmael. And it says that Abraham loved Ishmael, and he had to send him away. Abraham already knew what it meant to give up something costly. And God comes to him and says, no, there's more. give up your son, your only son. Think about how that rang in his ears. He's my only son now because God had gave up Ishmael. The son you love. God, this is the son that you've promised. I'm supposed to have seeds that are like the sands of the sea, children, so many children that turn into nations. And yet, God, you want me to come and you want me to sacrifice him. You want me to give up all. Worship tests what we value. It not only does that, I want you to catch this, church. If there's not something you leave with other than this is the one thing I really want you to leave with. Worship, sacrifice, it transcends your understanding. You see, when it's originating in God, he's defining the place, the program, the design, the time. He's God sovereign over all of that. We expect to understand all of that. Actually, we demand to understand that. We say, God, you're against human sacrifice. Come on, Cain and Abel, I know this story. God, that's not doctrinally correct. You wouldn't ask me to do that. Come on, you're not being reasonable now. That's again, I'm hearing pizza. No, I think that's not God. Go somewhere else. Think about it. We say, okay, God, I'll do it. We make deals. I'll do it. You tell me the outcome before I say yes. Right? How about this one? Okay, God, but I deserve to know why. I deserve to know why. I think that's probably why Sarah's not mentioned in the story. It doesn't say Abraham told Sarah what was happening, where he was going. He's probably like, see you, babe, we're going to go, do some hunting. Let guys do out in the forest. Because she would have heard and be like, now what? I want to know why. What is going on here? Can you imagine that conversation? Abraham probably just avoided it altogether. She's not even mentioned in the story because, that would have been tough. She gave birth when she was like 100 years old. She's like, you're going to do what with my son? Just saying, man. I've never done that. I don't want to do that. Whew. We expect to know. So our worship is misplaced when we hold back or when we disobey God until he meets our demands for understanding. Lord, I'll do this if you show me why. I'll do it if you give me the outcome. In those situations, who really is Lord? Worship. I'm going to read on in Genesis 22. Verse 4. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went, both of them together. And Isaac said to his father, Abraham, my father. Notice in the passages, the second time Abraham says, here I am. He says, here I am, my son. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? You see, Isaac was a bit grown at this point. He knew what it took to do this process of sacrifice and worshiping God. And he says, God, Father, we have everything here except we're missing the key thing. We're missing the lamb. What's the deal here? And he said, Abraham says to him, let me find my spot. God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And so they both of them together went, and when they came to the place of God, which he told them, Abraham built the altar and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. Notice the third, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, And behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide." The third point I want you to notice is worship is defined by God's provision. Worship is or originates in God. Worship requires a sacrifice, and worship is defined by God's provision. You see, the first "here I am" was Abraham with God responding to the initiation of this worship. The second "here I am" is him responding to Isaac. And think of Isaac traveling around. Imagine yourself as Isaac. You're walking around with your dad in these hills. You're trying to find the spot the Lord is leading to. And the whole time, there's an elephant in the room. What's the elephant in the room? There's no lamb. There's no lamb. So they find a spot, and finally Isaac gets up enough courage to say, "Hey, I think we're doing this wrong. There's something missing. Dad, what's the deal here?" Think about that. Think about being in that position. He said, God's going to provide. Doesn't it feel like sometimes when you're in that place of worship, you're in that place of tension? It feels like this is an impossible thing to offer God. And that's when we start to do all the jujitsuing moves to change the terms and to figure out a way where it can look like we did what God asked, but then not actually do it, understand it, and still be in control of it. And here, what does Abraham do? Can you hear his voice after losing Ishmael, after giving up so much? Can you hear his voice with this surrender? God's going to provide. I know he's going to provide. You see, Hebrews tells us that Abraham went to this believing that even if he sacrificed his son, that God would raise him back to life again. This is where trust comes in. You see, when God defines the worship, when God calls you to that place of impossible, he calls you to that place where you don't understand why he is asking you to do this. This is the place where he crumbles the kingdoms and the castles of transactional relationship with him, and he says, "No, trust me." And this is the kind of worship that changes you. This is the kind of worship that calls you out of treating God like some paid lover. If I do this, God, then I expect this. Okay, God, you want me to do that? If I do that for you, then you're going to do this for me. You see, church, you have to be called to a place of worship that transcends your understanding so you can be called to a place of trust. And when you enter into that place of trust, we are in that place of living sacrifice. God's interested in about life, not in you having it figured out. God's interested in about life, not in you having your doctrine right. God's interested in you about life, not your bank account being all together. God will provide. After all, God is responsible for the miracle of Isaac. Isaac was already a miracle child, and yet Abraham had already paid the price of a son. But not only do we see Isaac, we see something beautiful in this moment. God is not only the origin or the provider of Isaac, but also the ram. This ram shows up out of nowhere, supernatural provision, and it points us to the reality of substitution, which I'm going to get to in a moment. Jesus speaks to us of substitution. He speaks to us of sacrifice. He speaks to us of this provision. You see, this passage points us to the fact that God owns everything and provides everything. So the things that he's asking from you, you can never give to him in exchange for something else. He already had it to begin with. But he calls you to that place of realizing he's ultimate. He's the one who gave it to you. This is worship. So I want to point something out here. When we live a religious experience, we live a transactional relationship with God. God is a vending machine for us. I want you to hear this. In the end, you think, I think, we think we've given more than God. You see, if you're in a place of being stingy, I can't do that, I can't commit to that, no, I don't want to do that. You hold back, you reserve yourself. In worship, we're here, we're all dancing, we're singing, and you just kind of stand in the shadows. In ministry, you stand back in the shadows. In your family, you're standing back in the shadows. Wherever it is, you're standing back from that place God's called you to press in. You think that you have given more than God has. Man, I don't know how that's hitting you. That cuts me. If you're irreligious, if you're here, you say, I don't follow Jesus, here's what I want you to connect the dots to with the law of scarcity and with worship. You just see God as worth less than other things. Something else is ultimate to you. Something else you're making sacrifices for. Something else you value more than you value God. God is just some distant agent in the sky. God's just some theory. God is just some opiate for the masses to keep people in control, which that isn't even true when you look at the underground church in China, other places. God is just some fantastical idea. God has made up all these things. You use that to justify pursuing the worth of other things. And this morning I think God would say, why don't you just for a moment consider what is of ultimate value in your life? Even if you don't know God, you might say, but you can ask that question. What is ultimate for you? What is ultimate? All of this passage points us to the brazen altar. There's a place with a symbolic piece of furniture and an act that goes along with it in what we see in the Bible as the tabernacle. There was this building, this structure that was made that was to give people access to God's presence in a world that is separated from God. So I want to just show you this picture. There's a picture here. This is the bronze altar. It's made out of bronze, symbolic of judgment in the word, along with some other things. And what they would do is they would take a lamb or an ox. They would come and they would literally slaughter it. They would slit its throat. Blood would be poured out, would be washed onto this altar. They would hook up this animal on these horns, which they call the horns of mercy, actually, and they would slice this animal apart. Before they slit its throat, they would put their hand on and say, this one goes in my place. This idea of substitution. This sacrifice is needed. Something needs to go in my place. Just like Isaac, this ram came and went in his place. That's what Hebrews 11 tells us. Actually, Isaac did die. But the ram was the one who took his place. And we see this here in the tabernacle. This points us to Jesus and what he's done for us. C.S. Lewis notes, the smell of the temple is butchered animals and blood, burnt flesh and incense. This is the smell of holiness. This, he would say, is the smell of worship. This, church, is the smell of good worship. This was an ancient understanding of worship. You see, it would cost a lot. It would be like giving up a car to bring a cow to come and slay at the altar. I remember my first experience slaying a goat. It was awesome. And that's why I've never done it again. No, I'll let somebody else do that. Somebody was on the back of the animal. I was on the front of the animal with a knife, and you cut the throat, and there's so much emotion going on in your body. And for me, I was just like, it was like this crazy adrenaline rush, and all the blood came out, and this terrible sound was coming from the animal, and we laid it down on the ground, and the person I was there with, it's like, okay, here's a knife, let's start cutting this thing up, and I was like I was in shock, like, I just did this to this animal, and this guy has done this before, and he comes over, and he's just like, yeah, it's dead, it's fine, he's poking its eyeball, and I'm like, oh. This is the act of worship. You see, the death of the animal at the brazen altar confronted the death inside the worshiper. You make decisions tomorrow with where you're going to put your time. It's a confrontation of death in your life, whether you see it that way or not. where you choose to place value on something, you do so because you get something out of it. And we need to worship to cover up the death that's working in our life. This is what we see in the brazen altar. Psalm 50 and 51 helps expand this idea to a bowed life. God says through David, oh, you don't delight in these animals or a burnt offering. You delight in a broken and contrite spirit. You're not going to deny those things. You see, the animal pointed to something so much deeper. Our worship, our decision for, oh, I'm going to do this instead of this, our sacrifices, all of it is like an iceberg, and we can just see what is cresting over the surface of the water. But underneath it is a deep longing for wholeness. Underneath it is a deep longing for freedom. And so we're pursuing things. We're giving value to things, and they're giving value to us for the sake of covering up those areas in our life where we feel broken, where we feel in bondage, where we feel unwhole, and we're saying, will you let this cover me? We all make sacrifices. We all worship so we can be whole and so we can be free. We just don't see it that way. Sometimes we define it differently than that. Which reminds me of a yellow balloon. It's okay to laugh, I know. It's like, it's talking about dead goats and now a balloon. Can you guys see this? Is this big enough? Oh, I just got lightheaded. What's the deal here? What's the deal? All right. So, this is how worship works. I want to connect the dots for you guys. Last week, my daughter Courage had a yellow balloon. My daughter Lucia decided that somehow her life was just incomplete and broken. She wasn't whole without having a yellow balloon. And so my 4-year-old daughter, Lucia, decided to steal this yellow balloon from her sister. She took it. She was like, this is mine. I am not giving it up. And of course, you can go in and attack somebody to get the balloon, and then what happens? It's going to pop, right? So my daughter, Courage, is not dramatic at all, ever. This ensuing drama began to unfold. And as a dad, I can come in with a heavy hand and say, okay, you have to give the balloon. The 10 Commandments say stealing is bad. But I'm in my 30s now, and I know a thing or two. Well, maybe 2, but not more than that for those of you who are older. So I basically told Lucia, okay, if you want to live by stealing, you're going to reap the consequences of stealing. So I gave my daughter Courage the permission to take whatever she wanted from my daughter Lucia. Now we're approaching bedtime at this point. And Lucia has really sunk her teeth into this yellow balloon. This yellow balloon is now her God. You think I'm joking? I'm serious. This is it. She is willing to sacrifice anything for this yellow balloon. So Courage is taking things. She comes into me, Dad, she's not responding. She doesn't care. I just took all of her dolls. Okay, take something else. Dad, she's not listening. I took her clothes, take something else. She comes in again. I was like, oh, I got a good idea. It's bedtime. Take her blankets and her pillow. She takes her blankets and her pillow, and by this time, Courage is starting to feel bad that she's like my minion, doing my biddings. And Lucia lays in bed and says, how can I sleep without a pillow and a blanket? She comes in and tells, and I was like, I'm not going to do anything about it. Give her her balloon back. Well, she thought this balloon could comfort both her head and her body, keep her warm. So she held on to the balloon. So Courage gets this great idea. I'm going to steal her mattress. Lucy is losing it at this point. I'm going to have to sleep on wood slats tonight? What's the deal? So Courage gets the mattress off of her bed. Lucy is laying on the wood slats. I'm laughing. Carrie is like, what are you doing to our kids? I'm like, she is a worshiper. She's worshiping that yellow balloon right now. And she's making sacrifices to bow down. Woo, yellow balloon. And pretty soon she relents. And she gives up the yellow balloon. She realizes, okay, this is a bad deal. Donald Trump would not make this deal. It's a bad deal. So what's your yellow balloon? What's your yellow balloon? Let's go with success. Success is my yellow balloon. Okay? So you're a dad. Success is your yellow balloon. What are you getting from the yellow balloon here of success? Well, one of the things is it covers up the shame and the lack of respect you experience when you go home. Because your kids are a mess and you don't have any intimacy with your wife and you have no idea what you're doing because, quite frankly, we have been raised in a fatherless generation. You're covering up your own pain, your own suffering, and your own sorrow because when you go to work, people are paid to respect you. When you go to work, you know what you're doing there. You've been trained. And maybe work isn't doing it for you. You start a side job because you want to live into your own vision. I'm here to tell you today, there are people in this room who have successful businesses, and they would tell you today, if you're doing that and you're putting your family on this brazen altar and you're slaughtering them, they would tell you, it's just a yellow balloon. The successful business and job is just a yellow balloon. What about somebody who's addicted? Alcohol, pills. We might write on here, pain-free. God, don't make me experience pain. Not like Abraham. You see, Abraham didn't just put Isaac on the altar. He was on the altar himself. He loved his son, pain-free. So we run to the bottle to cover up the deep emptiness or loss that we're experiencing. We don't want to feel anymore because it hurts too bad to feel. So we set our job on the altar and we slaughter it. We set our family on the altar and we slaughter it. We set our liver on the altar and we slaughter it. It's done. But I don't have to feel any pain. What about this one? I'm going to call this one the boy. But the boy completes me. Really? He took you away from your family. The boy. I just want to feel loved. To cover for rejection. People aren't loving me the way that I think I should be loved. And so I'm going to pursue the dream of the PG-13 movie. He's not a believer yet. But he will become a believer because I'm worshiping him and I'm telling him to worship Jesus, right? It doesn't work. So we slaughter, we sacrifice. What's your yellow balloon? What makes it onto your iCal or into your budget? More importantly, what doesn't that God's called you to put in there? Who or what is one thing if God asked you to give up, you'd quit? I'm done, God. I'm done with church. I'm done with my marriage. I'm done with you. I'm sick of it. What or who must you control in order to have peace, joy, wholeness, the good life? Oh, if I could just get my dad to praise me and agree with me, I would be whole. Oh, if my pastor would just sign off on this, Man, it would feel good. Most of our lives, we say we have a food issue, we have a purity issue, we have an anger issue. Really, when in reality, we have a worship issue. We're holding on to yellow balloons. Your living sacrifice. What you're really longing for, though, is a substitute. You see, the unlimited needs you have, the desires that you have, the shame and the bondage and the brokenness that is in your life, you're trying to cover with finite things, and they never work. They're just like this yellow balloon. And this points us to Jesus. We demand someone else pay the price. It's all finite, and we know it's never going to be capable of covering the infinite that we have. And in a moment, it can be gone. The success can be lost. Health can be eroded. It's finite. And then we're left in the hollowness of our shallow worship. You see, what we worshiped, what we gave all for, didn't give all for us. It never could. It wasn't ultimate. The sacrifice wasn't worth it. I'm going to bring this to conclusion. C.S. Lewis put it this way: it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We're far too easily pleased. I'm going to have Isaiah come up to share concluding thoughts here, and then we're going to take communion together. Ultimately, all that we make sacrifices for points us to our need to deal with the most scarce thing we have, which is life itself. You see, at the altar, the brazen altar, here today with communion, when we look at the story of Isaac, when we look at Jesus, this place, we are confronting death. You see, Jesus invites you to the table, and when you go to that table, he calls you to confront death. He calls you to lay down your yellow balloons and confront the places of shame and rejection and isolation in your life. Hebrews 10:4 tells us it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to cover our sins. The finite is insufficient to confront and cover our death. But it's for this reason Jesus came, which makes him of ultimate worth. God's love isn't based on the law of scarcity. It's based on the mystery of superabundance. So church, this morning, would you stand with me?